All right, today we are looking at elements of narrative film. Now, there's lots. So let's start here with what we're going to look at. We can't look at everything here, but we can certainly talk about the narrative structure and what is narrative in general. Um, so if we look at actually, let's look at what is narrative first. I'm not going to write it out because it's on the PowerPoint, um, but we can put the kind of key components here for this. So what is narrative? You have narrative, narrative movie, narration, and narrator. And so the narrative, as it shows, is the cinematic structure in which filmmakers have selected and arranged events in a cause and effect sequence occurring over time. What that means is, I mean, it's the specific structure that's been set up in a series of events to tell the story, right? And then you have the narrative movie, and the narrative movie is a fiction film as opposed to other modes, right? With documentary, experimental films, it is specifically the main type of movie that is made. Almost most films are narrative films. It's storytelling, right? Which is the next one, narration. It's the act of telling a story. It's storytelling, and there are a variety of components in that of storytelling that take place. And so, in order to have a film that's a fiction film, it has to have that storytelling component. This works the same for novels, right? If you have writing and stuff with novels, you're going to follow this exact same information. Now, of course, how like things are shot and stuff like that, and when filming scenes and stuff like that is where it moves into film versus a story. But a lot of what we're looking at today actually is connected to what you would do if you were writing a novel as well. And then the narrator, who or what tells the story. So I'm just going to write, because it's on the PowerPoint there, so I'm not going to write each of those components outside. I'll just write the list, and you can reference the PowerPoint for those specific things, right? But so you have the narrative, you have the narrative. Oops. Well, that's going to bother me. Let me just start over with that. The narrative movie. You have the narration, and you have the narrator, right? And so that you get these components together of then what combines and is a narrative. But there's different parts of that structure then that we're going to look at. So a typical narrative film follows, or let's look at, we'll just call it, say components, right, of it. One is that you're going to have that is going to follow the story of a character, right? Usually, but not always, the protagonist. And then you're going to have a chain of events take place. Now, sometimes you could have not a single character you're following, but just the chain of events. And then it has a beginning, middle, and end, which there are many variations of this as well. We're going to look more at this. This is specifically with the 3-act structure. It's certainly the most common. And then there's like tons and tons of variations of this with that. And then you have, we're going to talk more about plot in a second, but with this short like introduction with it, right? The plot then is a particular arrangement essentially of events and how they're presented in the film. essentially, and the plot and story order are very similar, but it's essentially the idea of what's happening. Think of like so you have these different components of the character, the events, the beginning, middle, end, which is part of that, and the plot then is going to be what is taking place. And then if you think about it, then the idea is the challenge for filmmakers is how to make something compelling and coherent, but then that has a structure that works for audiences. The main areas we're gonna I guess I could put additional components. I'll put that. I already have the components on one part here. Additional components that we're going to be looking at then with this is going to be the plot and story order, which again are very similar in structure. You're going to have the types of stories, characters, time, like how narrative time versus real time, and then the narrator. All right, and again, this is also the thing with this. This could be a whole. You could have like, I don't know if you have like quite a whole class, but you could spend a lot of time on this because there's so many different deviations of this. There's not one clear specific thing. So for example, here's one that's a little bit different than the list I just gave, right? You have character, but setting, conflict, and theme are different here. Conflict goes into the plot. We're going to talk about conflict when we talk about the plot. And setting is kind of part of the plot and story order because of what's in it. Now, there's a whole separate section you could have on setting too, looking at location, the importance of locations in an event, but it certainly is connected to the plot and story order, and the different types of movies, like for types of stories versus like A-B story, parallel, 3-act story. I would kind of put the theme and setting into that. So it's also just slightly different wording, right? If you put the conflict in with the plot and you put these two in with the types of stories, and then we are adding narrator and time to this list. So again, this one I put it in because I wanted to point out, and we're going to see this several times, that like I have like 3 or 4 examples. For example, characters. There's tons and tons of different lists of like, what are the main characters? What are the main archetypes in characters? Well, no one fully agrees because there's different opinions. There's also, depending on the genre, there's different archetypes for different genres too. So you could argue, well, here are the overarching ones that cover all film, but if you looked at sci-fi versus Western versus horror, there's going to be different archetype characters that usually show up in each of those that maybe aren't part of the whole. So again, it's a big topic, and it covers a whole lot of area with that. Okay, so that's kind of like the introduction. So let's start off by looking at plot and story order, because this is important to the structure of the film. So if we start with plot order and what's going on with that, you could look at this as the plot is specifically the sequence of events adopted or used, right, in telling the story. Okay, and then story order is going to be, let's move this up just a little bit, the sequence of events, the chronological skipping parts of the words. Come on, there we go. The chronological sequence of narrative events, which is encompassed in the plot. So we can give an example. There's a couple good examples of this. I won't write all this out, but I will write where I'm giving the example. So the movie Sunset Boulevard. And then we're gonna look at two. Sunset Boulevard lets me right here, and Leaving. It's a French film called Leaving. These are two good examples of plot order and story order. What's interesting with both of these, I will write this one part here, is that both of these start with the end and then come back around to the end. Right? So that you get this circular structure of the film. So let's look at Sunset Boulevard first. All right. Here's the poster for Sunset Boulevard. And my son trying to come in. Hang on just a second. I shouldn't have moved it up all the way. It's hard to see how to get it out of here. In show. All right, let's do that. Hang on just a second. Okay, sorry. He was trying to come into the room and then didn't close the door. So Sunset Boulevard, this is the film poster for it. And this is the film begins with the whole aftermath of a murder that we see, right? You have this unidentified man floating face down in the swimming pool, and this is essentially this is the end of the film. You don't necessarily know that at the beginning, so we're gonna have the end, then you get the whole story, and then it goes back to the end of the film again. So we see this is what you're first introduced to, and then basically, near the end of the film, about 100 minutes later, preceding the final scene, this is what we get again, but we actually now understand the context of the story of what this is happening here. So what it's about is a man that's a down on his luck screenwriter who's trying to make it in Hollywood, and his relationships with a former silent movie film star. And the story has this arc of from their first encounter to his seduction to his death. Right, that's the plot and story order with that. However, like I said, it's not a linear story because it's circular in the sense that you end back up at the end of the film. It comes full circle into understanding what's going on. And what this ends up doing is it provides this kind of cautionary tale of the dangers of Hollywood, essentially. Like it's even called a Hollywood story in the poster. But so what it does is the film tells us not only the basic storyline, the cautionary tale, but the ending, right? And by putting the ending first and then coming back around to it's that repetition of highlighting that important point. But again, it still has, so it's very similar to others. It just has the end, beginning, middle, and end, right? So it just adds this first piece to what is the traditional 3-act structure that we'll look at and stuff. But what it does is both of these films, the Leaving is going to do the same thing. But I would say argue that Leaving does it in a more creative way of you not necessarily knowing. Like, we don't know who this is at first, but like it's basically that inevitably at the end of the film we're gonna find this out, and the protagonist's story is essentially fated to this from the beginning, and it's just one of the ways that you can do this. The rest of the film is essentially an explanation of how another person's Hollywood dreams has been corrupted by Hollywood. Now, in a very similar vein, but I think and more surprising, is with the French film Leaving. So in this one, the film opens up with a couple in bed. She's awake and he's asleep snoring. We hear her, she gets up. We see her get up and get out of bed. She goes off screen, and then we hear a shot. The assumption is she has killed herself, right? And so you have more of this vague ending, right? That's off screen. And then it goes to, right, the start, the beginning, the middle, and then the end, which is now clear. So basically what this story is following her unhappiness with her husband, of like he's controlling, and she has kids in her life, and they're gonna renovate, and then she ends up meeting this man that's gonna do that. She has an affair with him. She wants to leave her husband. He ends up being super vindictive towards her, controlling the finances, her life, just creating very negative consequences. It ends up with them going and stealing from technically her house, but her husband's house too. Her new romantic interest ends up, getting arrested for it. She goes and begs her husband and says, "Look, it was not him, it was me. I was just taking stuff that was mine. I will do anything, just, tell the police that it was actually me that took stuff." And so he agrees if she will stay with him. So then it goes back to her being unhappy again, being with him, but he's also again still a jerk. And the end scene then is them in bed, him asleep snoring. Only what we find out at the end, right, of that off-screen scene that we missed, is it pulls back to that end scene where then we see that she has actually killed him, not herself. And then there is what you could argue the resolution ending, which in this, again, this is how it's different than Sunset Boulevard, because you have the ending, and then you have the ending you see again from a new perspective, but it gives us some after that event where she then goes off and meets up with the person that she actually loves, right? And so you have this additional resolution after what we initially thought was the very ending of the film, because of that. So with this structure, right, you have what it is really almost a flashback scene, in that you have what happened, and then it takes you back to before that event. Now, flashback is often something that is utilized in narrative story order and structure. So, right, the plot is like what's actually going on with this. Where are we at here? C. We'll go D. But in the story order, right, this is one where the plot is what is happening in both of these films, right? In Sunset Boulevard and Leaving, the events of what I told you about the story. But the story order is that circular structure for Sunset Boulevard, especially, of the end, beginning, middle, end. And then in Leaving, the end, beginning, middle, end, and then resolution, right? And that story order works within the plot of the film to tell a story in whatever way that it's being used. Both of these scenes use flashback, and flashback scenes are essentially just a story that a scene or sequence of events that takes place in the past. And a lot of times, now there's two ways that it can be done with this. So here, a scene or sequence of events that take place in the past. Now with this, this is super common. It's a common storytelling method because it allows the viewers to learn about something in the past. And there's various ways. This goes into time when we get into narrative time as well. But the idea that you have events happening and then you get a flashback scene. So what it can do with this is it can be used as the device that I just explained with the two films, right? Where it can shape the entire plot and story order, right? Like Leaving and Sunset Boulevard, or it can provide context to something that happened in the past, without having, and this, I think this is an important part of it, without having to cover everything in the past. Right, so if you're trying to explain an event that's important to why a character is doing something, right? What's their motivation for this? And so you need that information of, well, they're doing this because of this event that happened to them in the past. You can do a flashback scene and show what happened, which explains their motivation. But you didn't have to give that entire story ahead of time, which would be a longer thing and would bog down the overall story. So that's in the short of it, right? It provides context. That's what it provides, and the context that then helps understand the overall. Well, it doesn't always understand the overall film. Helps understand the previous scene or events shown in the film, right? So that you know, okay. So for example, in the one where it shapes everything, right, we get the scene where they're dead. Then the entire film is a flashback of what happened. So the difference is Sunset Boulevard is an entire flashback and then ends again right where it started. Leaving is mostly a flashback, but then moves forward past those events at the end when she goes off to find her love interest. That's not her husband because she killed him. So it can be the entire film, it can be most of the film, it can be a very small section of the film where it's just looking at providing context for a couple things, right? It also is a good way of showing memory. So it's one of the ways it's used is for a character to highlight like that something they remembered, right? Like, so you're going on and something's happening and then you want to show that the character has remembered an event, then you can do a flashback to that scene where they remember what had happened, and it's often used in that context as well. So like I said, in these, this is a type of technique that's used in plot order and story order and stuff. But that one of the things that's unique, I think, with Leaving is that you're still surprised by the ending. Like in Sunset Boulevard, when it comes back to the ending, you're like, oh, okay, now I know who that was and what was happening. Although you usually kind of guess that it was the protagonist when that's who it focuses on. In Leaving, you start with an expectation of that she killed herself most of the time. That's the assumption that people have. And then are surprised when it comes back to the ending with a more context to realize she didn't kill herself, she killed her husband, right? And then you get the rest of the story order with her leaving the house afterwards. Now there's another type which is called flash forward. Flash forward is used less frequently than flashback, and it is just what it says, right? It's a shot or scene or a sequence, right? Have extra ors there. That projects future, that shows future events. Now, one of the things with this, of course, is that people can know what happened in the past. The main characters can know what happened in the past, but how do they know the future? So, flashbacks can show ordinary events, things and activities and memories that happened in the past. Flash forward then suggests usually something paranormal or magical, right? That someone has an ability to see the future, right? It's not a normal ability, right? So if a character is having a flash forward scene, they have to have some reasonable explanation of why they're able to do that, and there's nothing in like the normal world that allows for that. So then it usually is paranormal or magical that allows that they get, you have this gift of foresight and can predict the future kind of thing. Or premonitions. Premonitions are the other one that's used sometimes like that, where it's not, it skirts the edge of realism and magical. That you're having this loose premonition, that feeling with some vague flash forward ideas, or that it's way to express that premonition, right? So like that you get this bad something like it was the same movie I didn't look up again that I should have looked up, with the one again with the death where they escape the plane due to a premonition, only to then get killed in more gruesome ways because death has to account for those people that were supposed to die. But the person on the plane gets the premonition of that the plane's going to explode, and so they get off. Well, it doesn't mean that they actually saw the plane explode in their head, but that it's a way to express that feeling of dread, or that something bad was going to happen, and then that's the visual cue showing us that feeling they were having, even if they didn't necessarily see that. But that one skirts the edge of that magical paranormal structure, or it just goes full blown to, right, that they can see the future and stuff like that. This one's less of a story telling structure or mode. We'll say device, right? And usually it's meant to be this momentary interruption to the logical flow of the narration, right? That you have this normal forward flow of the story, and a flash forward kind of breaks it up. Essentially, right, it's jarring. And really what this does, and sometimes the reason it's used, is that plots that scramble or withhold specific events in the film can engage the audience, essentially, because you have to pay more attention to it to understand what's going on. So, for example, Memento is a good example of this, because with this, right, then you have to pay attention. So let's say pay more attention to make sense of the plot and logic of the story. So in Memento, if you don't pay attention carefully to the story, you're going to get lost, because it's all jumbled up. And they help some with like the color scenes versus the black and white scenes, to at least give you a trigger identification of what story's being told. But it still requires a lot more concentration than just a very stereotypical narrative that we're familiar with. That we know, okay, it's going to start at the beginning, it's going to move to the middle, and it's moved to the end, and it tends to follow the structure because we we see these stories so often, we're familiar with it. And again, so story order and plot can often be the same, since chronological order is the traditional way to structure a screenplay. But put that, I guess, as the essentially story order and plot, right? So often the same, because of the chronological order is the most traditional way to tell a story. It's the most logical. It's the one we expect, right? When they're different, right? So when you notice that there is a difference, then you want to start, thinking about or questioning, move up here, like, why did the filmmaker choose to plot the events the way that they did, and how is that structure important? So why is the structure important? What meaning does it give? What does it add to the film? Because the filmmaker intentionally chose to not follow the normal chronological structure. We'll say, what is the purpose? Right? Because you guarantee there's a reason for it. It's definitely, it's not just done for fun, right? They're using it to make a point, or be able to tell a story in a certain way. All right, the next part is the stories in 3 acts. And this is the most traditional way of narrative films, is the 3-act structure. And so you have Act 1, and then the most generalized terms of this, it's that during Act 1, expectations are raised. And then in Act 2, you have the transition to expectations are confounded, which essentially this is where you have a lot of the conflict. The conflict can start in Act 1, but it continues in Act 2. In Act 3, oops, that's not 2. 1. In Act 3, expectations eventually are resolved. You do have with the resolve that usually first there is declining action and then resolution. Right, so Act 3 is not the immediate resolution where bam, you're done. It's that it has the action and events begin to wrap up, and at the end of Act 3 is when the resolution takes place. So we can give an example with this as well. My Best Friend's Wedding is a good example of this very structured 3-act narrative. But before we look at that, let's look at, so I have 2 of these here, and you can see how this is part of, this is the 3-act structure is part of the plot, right? So you have, and this I like, this one is more like straightforward, right? This one is just meant to imply that things can kind of go up and down. But right, that you have at the beginning an inciting incident, rising action, whatever that may be in Act 2, which is the midpoint of the film, and then pre-climax, things are starting to get to the boiling point, the end, right? And then you hit the climax in Act 3, and then it moves down in declining action, and then what they don't have on here is the end, is the resolution. But you can see that here too, right? So this one, beginning, middle, end, right? This is Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So you have the exposition and then conflict that takes place as it's rising up to the climax, rising action that's taking place. So this is where things get more intense in the story. And then you hit the climax where the final blowout or event or fight happens, right? It's that final big thing that takes place. And then the falling action is the decline and the wrapping up. That's kind of the best way to think of it, is the wrapping up of the story. And then finally at the end is the resolution. And that nicely wraps up the movie, if you will. So a good example of this 3-act structure in the plot of what is going on is My Best Friend's Wedding. Because it's pretty straightforward 3-act plot. Let's look first at the preview. This is an older film here, but the preview gives a good. That's the other thing with 3-act structures, right? You can give a, without giving away the ending, you can give away several, like Act 1 and Act 2, parts of each of those. Even sometimes putting in parts of Act 3 if it's not obvious. But even the preview gives us a good look at how this film is going to play out. So let's look at that here.
Michael and Julianne have been best friends for years.
The one constant thing in my life is that he'll always be there.
But they were never more than that.
Call me 4 a.m, whatever, we gotta talk.
Until he popped the question
I called because I met someone.
to someone else.
Well,
We're getting married.
Was in love with me every day for 9 years. Me?
I can see why.
Look, she has known him for what, like 5 seconds? I can't lose him, George. I'm a busy girl. I've got 4 days to break up a wedding and steal the bride's feather.
You see the girl with the diamond ring? She knows how to.
You know, I've never had a sister. All I've ever heard is Julianne this and Julianne that.
Michael and I were a wrong fit right from the start.
He said that too.
George, she's toast.
The only fear she really has is you.
So this means that I have 4 days to make you my new best friend and be my maid of honor?
What?
Why not? You're practically the best man anyway.
I just asked myself, what would Lucy Ricardo do in this situation?
Who's that guy?
I told him, George, if we're engaged, why be ashamed of it, right?
There's something wrong.
It's just a big surprise.
We thought you were a lesbian.
We have to talk about George.
You're jealous?
Crazy jealous.
Personally, I think Mr. Michael's marrying the wrong girl.
Just tell him you love him.
I realize this comes at a very inopportune time. Marry me.
The moment I wake up, before you put on your makeup.
TriStar Pictures presents
I'm the bad guy.
a story about finding the love of your life
Do you really love him?
and deciding
Or was it just about winning?
what to do about it.
I trusted you. Just tell me why.
Why did you trust me?
No, why did you pretend to be my friend?
Julia Roberts, Dermot Mulroney, and Cameron Diaz.
Lovely together.
My Best Friend's Wedding.
That's our maid of honor. She's from New York.
Okay, so one of the things that they do, and this is definitely the difference in what would be, so it is the traditional 3 acts, but they do a clever thing with the preview here, because in what would be, I suppose, like traditional normal expectation of like a romantic comedy is that he would realize, like, something would be wrong with Kim, right, his fiance, and he would realize that he actually was in love with his best friend this whole time, and they would end up being together, which is what the preview makes it look like. It's got the 3 parts to it. What it doesn't really show is the full aspect of Act 3 with the declining action and resolution. They just hint at that, because of course if they give that away, then you know the whole film. But what they do very cleverly and how they edited the preview is to make you think this is going to be like a traditional romantic comedy, where you're going to have if you're looking at Act 1, right? That's setting up the relationships among the characters, elaborating the expectations for the future. And so it's that Julianne and her best friend Michael, who've been best friends for a long time, she finds out that he's getting married. Now, there's more in the film that talks about why that makes sense. They show in the preview, right? She's on the phone. She falls off the bed when she hears. That's Act 1. And that's, here, we can go. Here's Act 1. This is part of Act 1 where she's flying. After hearing about it, she flies to meet him and his future wife. This is the scene from the airport. So with this, like they were best friends for 9+ years. They'd made an agreement that if they were 28 and hadn't been married and were not married to anyone, that they would get married themselves. So the time is basically there. She actually is talking about, like, she basically thinks like, we're going to be, we'll end up getting married soon because both of us are still single. Only then he calls, and that's where you see the scene on the preview where she gets the phone call and falls off the bed and tells her that he's found someone, that they're engaged, and then can she come to the wedding? And it's happening quick, right? And so she then is like, well, I need to break up this wedding because, and that's the conflict. That's the start of the conflict, right? So her decision that she's going to go and she's going to break up the wedding, that's the conflict of it. Act 2 then is and that's the middle of the movie. That's a good chunk of the movie, which is about her basically trying to make Kim look bad. And that's where the hijinks ensue, where it's the comedy part, right? Where they're both, bad things happen, crazy things happen. She's trying to, break them apart while also getting Michael to admit that he likes her. And then of course the kind of final rising climax of that is where they kiss and she sees that, which then you would think the traditional one would be like, she's horrible, and so then he's going to choose his best friend, but she isn't horrible. She's this sweet, kind person. And so after that, she ends up fighting back, which leads to the in Act 3, the declining resolution, where she pushes back and is like, no, you don't get him, and fights for him essentially, where then he makes his decision to get married in Act 3 with the resolution to Kim, and she accepts this and becomes the maid of honor. And the end result of this is actually realizing, I guess, that she didn't really want to marry him, that she's happy that he's happy, kind of thing. So it subverts the traditional romantic comedy structure slightly. It follows it for almost everything, but subverts it near the end. And instead of them getting together, right, she realizes she's happy for him and happy with that. She didn't really want to be married to him or be with him. There was more the idea of being alone, kind of thing. So like I said, and if you watch a lot of romantic comedies, you'll see the traditional structure in a lot of the films. But this follows very closely those 3 acts in the narrative of the film. And so it's a good one of providing that example of how that works with, like I said, the final showdown and then the declining structure and final resolution that closes up. All right, the next aspect is the hero's journey. So let's go to that one here. I think I'm on 4. If I've doubled my numbers here, apologies. So the hero's journey is with a protagonist, and the 3-act formula roughly matches the hero narrative. Now, the hero narrative or the hero's journey was initially proposed by Joseph Campbell, and it was about Greek mythology. So you can see there's lots of different hero's journey kind of diagrams. Some are more related to like Greek mythology. Some are more generalized so that it kind of works for every, kind of any type of story. but it has some specific aspects to this. Now, initially, it was about a lone male hero. Because of course, within Greek mythology, it was always about the male heroes. It can be about it with a female hero now too. So it's male or female hero. But if you go and like look at the original Joseph Campbell structure, it's a male hero because of Greek mythology. They didn't really write about women, or certainly they didn't write about women as heroes. Women were dangerous and were either victims or dangerous and caused problems in Greek mythology. That's it. They were never the heroes of the story. So we'll say it involves the hero, right, male or female now, who has to endure a journey, thus the journey, which usually was a fight, but it didn't have to be like directly a fight. It could be a quest. It could be a long, arduous event. Something though that was difficult to achieve their goal. Right? And this is usually, again, it's this kind of long process. It's not something that's easy. It's not meant to be easy. So there's 3 stages in the hero's journey as well. And again, this is why this lines up with the 3-act formula so well, because it almost could be parallel to it. That essentially you have the 3-act story, and alongside that the hero's journey can play out in this 3-act story. So in the most general terms, the hero ventures forth. Then you have they face a trial, right? Something difficult that they must overcome. So that's the difficult, long, arduous journey part of it. And then returns home successful. Usually with this, we'll say, and smarter and better. Not always monetarily. Sometimes they're poor at the end. Than when the story began. Right, but mentally, emotionally, whatever, they are better for it at the end. The key kind of thing with this, I think, the central theme to all of this in the hero's journey is searching for the answer to a pressing question, which is, who am I? The hero is almost always, the quest is connected to self awareness, right? The idea that they need to better understand themselves, and they have to go on this journey in order to do it. Now, like for example, in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is a great example of the hero's journey, right? He's trying to figure out who he is in this, and so then he has to go forward. I would argue too that one of the things that's really common in the hero's journey, again, that was the simplified form, is reluctant hero. Okay, a hero that, so we could put, so here you have the 3 parts, right? 1, 2, 3. Everyday life, right? The character, you introduce the character, they get a call to journey. This is a good, more detailed one, right? The reluctant hero. But something eventually pushes them forward to decide to go ahead with the journey. So in Star Wars, Luke, when he finds Obi-Wan, he's questioning, he doesn't know who he is. He is unhappy kind of with his life. And he finds Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then he invites him on this journey. But he just says, "No, I need to go back home, my aunt and uncle." But when he doesn't want to go. But then when he gets home, his aunt and uncle are dead. That is what pushes him to cross the threshold, right? So again, what I made on the list is the very basic bare bones outline of basically these parts here, right? But then you can definitely pay attention to these parts here, because this is part of it, right? Is that you have that everyday life, you have the call to the journey, you have that reluctant hero. And the reason for the reluctant hero is because it always makes them more, I don't know, morally superior. It makes them look like it's less likely to have someone be a hero if you're like, we need you on this quest. Yes, I always knew I was destined to be great right away. Then they have less of the heroistic qualities that people look for, right? A hero is someone who isn't jumping at the chance to be a hero. A hero is someone who has the characteristics and qualities to be a hero. And one of those is that you're not looking for that power or that status, but you get it because of your actions and the journey and your characteristics anyways. So that reluctant part of it is kind of an important aspect of, I guess, the true hero. There are other stories that play on that and have the person jump at the chance to go do it. But then a lot of times what they'll do with that is play with that, and then the person turns out not to be the hero, right? You think they're the hero for a good chunk of the story, and then only to find out that they weren't the hero, it was this other person. And usually that person is the more humble hero. You can put that, if it isn't reluctant, it's at least humble hero. Someone who's like bragging and boasting and go gung-ho because they think they're destined for this is less likely to be than the hero. They still can, and there's still stories that do, but if you look at most stories, it's got that. Then you have the actual part of on the road, as it says here, right? The journey itself. You have usually a mentor that like sets you up and prepares you for what you need to do, and then you have the long, arduous structure where it tests foes and challenges along with meeting allies, right? That's the part that it can't be easy, right? This part is supposed to be hard and challenging, right? This has to test you, or you know, are you really hero worthy if it was super easy? If you just waltzed on through and it took no effort, where's the hero component, right? People want that perseverance, that continued push, the not stopping and fighting through something difficult, right? And then it's going to the approaches, the actual like the fight scene, or you're making your way to whatever you need to finish off your journey. Then the ordeal or turning point, the actual event, fighting the bad guy, right? That's defeating the bad guy. And then the reward for defeating the bad guy. Then it's about going home. So, right, this could also be like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And it fits within that structure of the 3-act story. Then you end up back home. So this is the resolution, right? This is the decline in action and resolution. Right, this is the initial expectations and scene set, along with early conflict that takes place, and then you have the climax of the story there. So it, like I said, it often goes hand in hand with that. So that's the hero's journey. It's what's the thing that here's just another example of it that mixes it in with Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So you can see a little bit better with it, but it's the same type of thing. Again, refusing the call, but then eventually being convinced to go through with it. It's interesting to look at main characters, the protagonist, and then see where you can see the hero's journey play out. Because it's a very common, anytime you have a main protagonist that is set up to be, in some form or another, a hero, they're going to kind of fit into this narrative. All right, the next part then is types of stories. Come on here. So other types of stories, we can put types of stories here. One that is, so we already looked at the main one with the plot and Act 3, Act point 1. Another type, though, that is commonly used is A and B stories. With A and B stories, then, it's essentially dual stories. And what you have with this is there's an A story and a B story. But A and B stories, that we'll see, there's another one called parallel stories, which we'll look at, which has an A and B story, but it does it differently. So with A and B stories specifically, it prioritizes one of the narratives, usually story A. Doesn't really matter. Technically, you could have a BB, but usually just because of AB, right? It's story A. And then story B takes place at the same time, but it's kind of like we'll call it a sub-story, right? It's a side narrative. It tracks with the first narrative, but it's not as important. But what the point of with this is, one, it kind of so you can have like the main story, and then B can impact the main story. And the idea is at some point the stories will intersect. Now, usually this is connected to resolution, and the stories come together and they complement each other. It can also be used to help reinforce the main story, right? Or it can provide clarification to events in the main story. A good example of this, let me put this here, would be Bonnie and Clyde from 1967. I didn't put a picture of this one. In the Bonnie and Clyde story from 1967, because there have been other ones from that, the plot, story A is the crime spree, that story. That's all about them going and, you know, stealing and shooting up stuff. And then the story B is basically the fraught sexual relationship or sexual tension / relationship between them. And what happens with it, so there's this conflict of this sexual tension and dissatisfaction between them throughout the film. All the while, the crime spree story is taking place, which is the main story of the film. And then, near the end of the film, that sexual tension and problem is resolved right as they do their last crime spree that ends up getting them both killed. Right? So just as B is resolved and merges into story A, the story ends. So that's one way of doing it. The next one is parallel stories. Now this one's very similar, right, in that you have story A and story B, right? But with this one, so dual stories as well, A and B. So it's still there, but with this one, there is no prioritizing of the stories. They go together. They are told in tandem, and it's meant, you essentially you're essentially tracking both stories simultaneously. So they're both happening, they're both important, they still usually connect at some point. But instead of story A being the most important, story A and story B are equally important. But it gives you different perspectives. It can give you different timelines. It can give you different structures. But in the end, they usually come together still. And that explains, right? Like you see, oh, that's how they connected, kind of event to that. Okay, the next thing then is narrative time. What number am I on here? 6. So that was on the time. Now, really, this is the duration of time that elapses from the first to final events of the narrative. So, I mean, it's the time that the narrative takes. Time. And this can, so you can have the story, the narrative story, and plot cover the same time span. However, that's usually not what takes place. Like, so there's some films that's like, there was a TV show that did I can't remember the name of any of these. 24? Yeah, the TV show 24, where each episode was 1 hour, and it covered 1 hour of time in the day. And the whole season was 24 hours. 24 hours, I think, or 12. It was with they're like government people trying to stop terrorists and stuff like that. And they had a time clock that counted down the hour and would break up, like show different things, but all of it was taking place within that 1 hour. So in that case, right, the story and plot have the exact same time span. But those ones, I mean, that's why that show became very popular for a while, because it was unique. It's not usually what is done. And the reason for that is often because it can get boring. If, let's say you're telling a story and like you are trying to show, like, one, usually the stories are too big. So, right, that's one of the things, is we can put that usually the story is too long or lengthy to have actual time span, right? It can cover days. Like a lot of stories cover days, weeks, months, years. You obviously can't have a movie be that long. So instead, right, what you're going to do is that you're going to have what's called the screen duration, right, which this is the actual running time of the film. And again, occasionally it can match up with the narrative time. Most of the time, it doesn't. And then you have the story duration or narrative time. And that is, I'm going to move up. I want to move up for me here. That is the basically what the story duration, plot duration is made clear based on what the filmmakers choose to tell in full and what they choose to summarize or ignore. So that is the time that takes place in the narrative, and then with that, the time that is shown in full versus what is summarized or ignored. Right, and this is just, because you can't tell usually, like I said, the entire narrative time in a film. It's an example. This is the past that characters like bring with them into a film. The backstory. So here we can, example of this: the backstory of a character. Right? You can't tell. It's part of the story duration. But may not take up a lot of plot time. Right? And then also you could add screen time. Actual screen time could be a third component of that, because it would take up too much time of the film. And so you have filmmakers are constantly battling with like what time to show, because you have 90 to 120 minute running time. It's why films have gotten longer and longer. But one of the things to pay attention to that in this is what is shown in the film, right? What is excluded, what is not? Where does the time line up? Because that usually can be signs of what's important. And you can go back and forth. So you can have parts where it's not showing the whole time, and then you're going to end up with like where there's a part of a scene which does line up with film time, plot time, narration time. It all lines up, and then it goes back to kind of skipping ahead, and so while the plot suggests this time has taken place, we don't actually see it. There's this general maxim of screenwriting, which is this idea of arrive late and leave early. And the idea behind this is that, so in films, right, we often enter scenes after they've already started, right? And you get told what has happened, but you don't see it. And leave before the action is fully completed. And again, you either get, so if you show up to like a scene and it's like there's already something going on and the character comes in, either from inference or being told, you find out what has been happening. Then they take off and the scene maybe hasn't fully completed, right? Not everyone said goodbye and left. But you also get told or infer what takes place. This is a time-saving thing, essentially, to be able to figure out like how to fit aspects of the story into it. Now, another component of narrative time is ellipses. And what this is what I was kind of talking about with the use of on-screen omission of story events. Okay, and what this does is essentially it allows the film to cover a lot of time. You can't show all of that. So you skip stuff, right? Days, weeks, months, even years can take place with a single cut, right? So that there's that indication of time passed. Now you can be super obvious about this with intertitles that say 1 year later, right? 10 seconds later, 1 year later. Or it can just fade to black, and when we come back, there's new indications that a lot of time has passed for that character. For example, in the end of the, gosh, nice space. I'm bad with remembering names of the films until I see them. You have the Avengers and stuff, and Captain America goes to the past, and he's supposed to return his shield, but then something's wrong, and they're all trying to figure out what's wrong, and then it pans to and looking and seeing this old man sitting on the bench. And then he walks over and sees that it's Captain America, and he stayed and had a whole life that he wanted with the girl he wanted and stuff like that. Well, all of that happened in the plot, but it's not part of the actual time because it's all omitted. We make inferences with a small amount of dialogue that shares what he did, but you don't get all the details. You don't see everything that of how he lived his life to the fullest all these years and how he's now old. But the act of seeing him old, first the act of seeing that something was wrong and he didn't come back on the time he was supposed to, then the act of seeing him old implied that there was this whole other narrative time that took place off screen, that omission of that, right? And that one was done just by, you know, the idea of shifting to seeing him sitting on the bench as this old man, right? But you can just also fade to black, or you can have intertitles that show it too. It can also, so one is just for saving time. It can represent a gap in the character's memory or knowledge, so you can use it to showcase that. And the ellipses are also a way to allow the filmmakers to cue the audience of passage of time in some form or another, right? That's the idea with that one. And then you have time code. And this is a film that unfolds in real time. Not right real, apparently, with legibly. There we go. So specifically with this one, right, the plot duration or plot time corresponds to the scene duration, what you actually see, right? The various scenes, however long the scenes are, is exactly what the plot time is. They align. Usually time codes only happen for certain events, right? These are good. If you see this in a film, this is a good thing that's an important scene, right? It can heighten suspense. It can set up a sudden fight scene of violence that is in real time, right? It's usually something that's important. Rarely is it the whole film, because it's freaking hard to do. You just usually have too much story to have a whole film unfold in real time. All right, the next thing that we're looking at then is character motivation. We'll just say characters, because there's several parts to this. One is character motivation. This is also going to be one that has a lot of different options for it, okay? So with character motivation, right, it's important to know. If you understand character motivation, then you can understand their actions and choices in the film. So how do we understand character motivation? Well, through observation, right? Observing various details about the character, right? What gestures, I mean, obviously actions, the dialogue, and so on, right? I'll give you clues. Also the physical and external events or external actions, right? Because you can have external actions, and then of course things that they are internal that you don't see, but based on your observations, you can make inference about what the character is interested in, what's going on with that structure. Okay, now come on, move forward. All right, I'm gonna have to pause it. It froze here. All right, had to restart it, the application. It didn't like me. I obviously need to get a more powered, higher powered computer. It can't handle the recording well. So from this, these observations, right, we can start to figure the character out. Right, what are their motivations? Who are they? And this provides deeper understanding to the film and explanation of their behavior. It's really, you know, this is a good thing to pay attention to, right? Is who the character is. What is their motivation? What is their purpose, right? This helps you understand the character, and from that, usually part of the story, right? It helps the story make sense. Now with this, you also have character types. Now this is where we get into a lot of different types that can take place. There's a broad sense of it, which is there's we'll say the larger view. Let's look at it from the larger view. Now with this, you have static. This is the type of character that stays the same throughout the film. Then you have a flat character. Flat character, not a lot of dimension. And not a lot of information. These are the kind of characters that are sometimes called stock characters too, right? They're there for the background. They're not the main character type. A main character could be static. A main character could learn nothing and change not at all. Like they stay consistent in their qualities and who they are as a person through the whole film and learn nothing and change. Now, that's less interesting. Usually characters are more interesting when they're dynamic, which is the next one. But you technically could have a main character who is static. But you don't usually have main characters who are flat, because it's hard to have a main character who's flat, because the whole point of a flat character is you don't know much about them. They're there to move the plot forward. That's their purpose. And I mean, it's good to be able to identify those, right? So, you know, like this isn't really an important character. This is a character that just helps move the main character forward in some way, or is there as this kind of background scene for something, right? That you need this, the basically background actors, right? They're all flat characters. You don't get to know the background actors. They're there to fill out the scene, to provide a setting, to create an ambiance. That's what flat characters do. Dynamic characters are usually the main characters, and they specifically change throughout the movie due to the events of the story. So they change throughout the story due to events, right? They learn, they grow, they change their mind on things. Round characters, these are more complex than static or flat. And we know a lot of information about it. Now, you could put, they're usually like the best friend, right? They're the sidekick. Technically a round character could be a static character if they don't change at all, right? So they don't always have to be more complex. But even with that, even if you're a round static character, you're still more complex because we know more about them than we tend to know about the static character. So yeah, again, round characters, they're more robust. Who they are as a person and as a character is fleshed out more. And again, they tend to be like the sidekicks or you know, partners in a situation. All right, so you have this larger view. Then you have what would be archetypes for Well, we could put for different films, for different genres. Right? And so this is where it gets more complex because there are a lot of character types. And not everyone agrees like what the main character types are. In fact, like I said, it usually can be broken down into genre of what they are. But this is what we could put is this is the traditional group of characters for a particular story that are almost necessary to be there. So to give you an example of this, here's the one. This one's through Pixar stuff, right? The static character, right? They stay the same. The dynamic character, they change a lot based on the story. Flat character, we don't have a lot of information about. Round character, we know more about. But then if you get into here's some. The hero, the villain, the donor, the helper, the princess's father, the dispatcher, the false hero. And they give some examples here of you know who those could be in it and the general definitions. You know, usually you have a hero, you have a villain, you have a helper, a sidekick, and stuff like that. Those are almost always guaranteed to be in there in some way. But the other ones don't have to be. Here's a different one. This one's for the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator. This can be both for games, for writing, because video games have their stories as well. But this, I thought this was interesting to showcase, like that you have this idea of right, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, and that works for like fantasy, sci-fi a lot of the time. It also works for other types too. The soul types, those ones that are like complex and thinkers essentially. But it works for like well, it actually works. This works for several, right? You could have but these are usually protagonist. So this character archetypes often are like protagonist ones that you could have, the different type of protagonist. And then just to show you like all the different types of characters and stuff like this, right? This is just some of the characters. This is for supposedly epic tales, right? So you got the hero, the pirate, the fairy, the guards, the golem, the lunatic, the wanderer, the gravedigger. Now you wouldn't have all these characters in one film. But the point is that what we come to expect, oh, and there's one more here. Right, so here, again, you got the hero, the lover, the jester, the everyman, the caregiver, the ruler, the creator, the innocent, the sage, the explorer, the outlaw. We come to expect certain character types. So there's an expectation of certain character types in films. And where this aligns with genre, right, is if you have a specific genre of film, we usually can identify, well, move up again, there we go. Like this one, if we know the genre, it allows us to identify the type of character often pretty easily. Not always. Based on a few characteristics. Essentially, right, the hero has certain characteristics. The villain has certain characteristics. And this can be actions, like the language that they use, the clothing that they wear, you know, what they're doing, like specifically we could put their interactions with people, right? All of these things give us clues to these characters. For example, in a Western film, it's pretty easy to recognize the hero and the protagonist or hero with the antagonist or, you know, adversary, based on the clothing they're wearing, the way that they're acting towards other people, what they say. Very quickly you can get this set up, and music plays a role too, in like what music is playing when characters are interacting. That's another way that it does. But we then immediately have an idea, right, of what this gives us. With this is it allows us to quickly assume characters' motivations. This can help with screen time, narrative time, right? Because then what can happen is, even if you have that, you'd have, if it was in a novel, you'd write this whole backstory or the development of the character, and you'd get this whole information about the character. But in a film, the film time, you don't have enough time to do all that. So by setting up this kind of stereotypical character, people will infer their motivations and their purpose in the film. And it saves, it allows the narrative time to continue in the plot story order to continue, while saving actual film screen time. Because you don't have to provide that background information, because it's already established essentially in that structure. Character types also can set up, put D here, right? Is it can set up dramatic tension based on their character. Right, so if you know that you have a character that is the villain, they're going to act a certain way that's going to set the scene and stage. But it doesn't always have to be the villain. It just can be characters as they represent who they are as people. For example, in Jaws, you have 3 men that go on the same boat for the same purpose, to kill the shark that's terrorizing the beach and the town. But however, drama ensues on the boat because of the conflict in their fundamental character differences of who they are. And so you get this, it essentially creates tension, because, oh my gosh, they're arguing and fighting over how to kill the shark, because they are different. Their character structure sets them up to want to do things a certain way and respond a certain way. And then it leaves the viewer wondering, are they going to get to work together in time to defeat and kill the shark? Right? So it creates that tension and that suspense of the film because of the characters, right? So the types of characters are extremely important, not just for moving a story forward, or the fact that you tend to have these characters fundamentally as part of these scenes, but because it can set up the tension based on who the characters are to create the suspense and anxiety in a film, or fundamentally help move a story forward and actually have the plot continue, because you need that character to push it forward. But there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of characters, right? There's no set 5 characters, right? Because it depends on the genre of the film. It depends on what the filmmaker wants to do. It depends on, like, so you can have, I'd say the larger ones, static, dynamic, round, flat. That's a good baseline. And that can give you a hint into the character right there, without ever knowing whether they're the villain or whether they're the hero or the princess or the lover or the jester or whatever else. You get a sense of them just from those, and that's a good starting point. But the fact is that the more that you observe and understand the characters and the developments, we inherently, because we're told stories all our life and we're surrounded by narrative and storytelling, we have ideas about certain characters, which is why you have all these archetypes and structures, and that from that we make guesses pretty early on of what characters are going to be based on those observations. All right, the last thing then is dialogue and narration, the narrator. Dialogue is, I mean, it was an important shift, right, when it went from silent film to talkies. But in its most basic sense, if we look at dialogue first, right, it's what the characters say. And you can have films that have a lot of dialogue, and you can have films that have very little dialogue. There's some films that are the plot revolves around the dialogue, and there's other ones where it does not revolve around the dialogue, right? The dialogue is almost extra to what's going on with the story. But the dialogue it's delivered. Oops. It's delivered by the actors and can help explain or show the character, right, based on what they say, not just what they do, but what they say. Right, it provides that insight of what their motivation is, what their structure is. And then, like I said, you can have stories built around the dialogue where it's essential to the story, or stories where it is secondary. Right, it's there, it provides some context, but you could get away with not really paying attention to what they're saying, and it would still be you'd still understand the film. And then I've watched some where like it's all dialogue, and that if you don't pay attention to what they're saying, you're missing the point of the film. And then you have the narrator. And the narrator, some films have a narrator, not all films do, right? Some are just based on the dialogue and the action and the visual stuff that you see. And then you have other films that have a narrator, which essentially the narrator's goal, I mean, there's various goals for it, but they set up the story and provide comments and context. That's the broad sense of that, okay? There's a couple different types of narrators. The two big ones are first person and third person narrator. So if we look at first person first, right? This is the first person narrator is a participant or character. They are one of the characters in the film, right? This one, you know by them saying, I. If they're saying I, that's the signal that it's a first person narrative. So you have a character that essentially is giving you their perspective on events in the film. This is, I would argue, the first person narrative is one that can be, come on. Oh no, did it just freeze again? I'm so close. There we go. Let me just finish. That it can be played with a lot. Because right, it's one of the characters, like, so instead of just watching what happens and what they say to people to understand the character, they're coming out and talking to you directly to explain themselves, to explain their story. And so one of the things that you end up getting a lot with first person is that they are the unreliable narrator. Not always, but right, you inherently have to be suspicious of first person narratives, right? You cannot always trust that the narrator is telling the truth. Right? They could just be telling you what they want you to know, right? And this very much can be used to shape the whole film. Right, because it can create unexpected events based on an unreliable narrator. For example, Memento, again, unreliable. And so you think it's one thing that's happening, and then you find out later, based on watching the events, that the narrator lied or just didn't have the memory or didn't know, right? And it doesn't have to be that they're not always truthful, right? They can just have limited knowledge. Because when it's first person, they only know what they know. They don't know what other characters know. They only know from their experience what they've seen, what they've done, what they've heard. First person narrative can't know what a character is doing that's not in their scene. So unless they're telling the story and it already happened, So there's a different type of narrative, right? If it's a narrative that's like, let me tell you about the story that happened. And then they're telling you because they know all this stuff, because they talk to other people, because this event already happened. But if it's a narrator in the present, then they can't always know everything. And that's part of how you can play with it, because they're telling it from their perspective, not from everyone's, right? Again, if it's telling the story from a past event, then they can be more knowing as a first person narrative. But there's still limitations, because you can't be all knowing unless you're the third person narrator. I can speak. Right. If you're a third person narrator, then this is sometimes called the God-like voice. Morgan Freeman is the best at it. He is the best narrator. Right. They're usually unseen. And not a character in the story. And don't have to be, but can be all-knowing, right? They know each of the characters. They know each of their motivations. So they can present and set a scene to us about what is going on, right? And so this gives you a larger view of events, right? Oh, Johnny says this, but really, this is what actually happened, right? So that they're clarifying, like, even though this character is coming off like this, that's not the truth. Here's the truth, right? And they know all the players. That's why it's the godlike voice or the godlike narrator, because they are the puppet master that knows everything that's going on and can explain and set up and here's what you need to know about what you're watching, right? And this can also be played with as well. However, the one trick with this is that they can be unreliable too, right? That you have to, with this, it's like you have to know the purpose and motivation of a narrator if you want to try to, I guess, predetermine how you should judge this. You're going to go in with certain expectations just as soon as you hear a narrator, which you might not think about. It just happens. But if you're trying to analyze it, then you want to go and be like, okay, what's the purpose and motivation of this narrator? Is it just to give us more context, right? Playing with narrative time because this is needed to tell the whole story? Or is it a clever trick, essentially, to direct us one way, right? It's that magician sleight of hand. Look this way while the action's happening over here. First person narrative is easier often to understand the motivation. They're wanting to tell their story from their point of view and usually make themselves look good. And so, you can almost usually assume first person narrator is not going to be fully reliable. They might be truthful. They might tell you what they know, but they also probably are going to tell it from their point of view, which is always going to be skewed. Versus a third-person narrator can be a little bit harder to determine the purpose or motivations. However, they don't always have to be godlike. They also can be limited. Let's say there was one that they'd used a narrator who had died, and so they were telling their story up till they died, but they didn't know all the pieces. And they were acting like a third-person narrator, but it was almost more like a first-person narrator, but they weren't an actual character in the film other than as dead. So, like, like I said, that it can play these different roles with that, and it's an important piece of understanding that motivation. Here, this one goes into a few others, right? So omniscience is the godlike one. First-person narration, omniscient narration is the godlike. You have all the perspectives. You understand everything that's going on. Restricted narration can be both first person and third person. They say third person, but first person is by inherent design restrictive because they don't know everything, right? They are not provided with all the details. Reflexive narration calls attention to the narration. That's one too. That one often plays with it, right? Where they're like, hey, I'm telling this story. Give that, this person's telling it wrong. Let me tell you what actually happened. Right, that's reflexive narration. Unreliable narration we talked about. Multiple narrations. This one you don't see very often, but multiple stories or perspectives with different narrators. they give an example, right? Babel and Pulp Fiction, but it's very rare. You rarely watch a film that has multiple narrations. Or again, maybe not very rare, but it's rare. It's not the most common one. All these other ones are way more common than multiple narrations. But this gives us, like I said, this different view on the film. And it allows the filmmaker to play with time. It allows them to set up expectations and scenes of what the film's going to be about. And they can totally mess with you and completely change the structure and your expectations. All right, we're going to stop there. For this one, I've talked long enough. So yeah, that will be that.